Today, we will be addressing the question of whether or not Al-Qaeda is a cohesive organization with strong and centralized control, intent, and direction. The results of our open source research indicate that it is not a centralized organization because, first, Al-Qaeda has now become a movement or a loose confederation of terrorist groups. Secondly, as part of this shift, the original Al-Qaeda, or Al-Qaeda proper, has lost central operating authority over the terrorist acts conducted by the groups within this movement. Also, though it is bound together by devotion to general ideals of global jihad, there is no universal intent or set of goals driving the entire Al-Qaeda movement. The Al-Qaeda movement also follows no single roadmap to achieve its diverse goals. The lack of a common strategic plan appears to have already caused rifts in the movement. Finally, when we considered all of the data, we also found that these trends are likely to continue over the next 6 to 12 months. When people think about Al-Qaeda, more often than not they imagine the Al-Qaeda of 9/11, led by Osama bin Laden and hiding under the wing of the Taliban. However, in reality, Al-Qaeda is a continually evolving phenomenon that has undergone some drastic changes. One way to look at the transformation of the global Salafi jihad under Al-Qaeda is to compare it to new releases of computer software, versions 1.0, 2.0, and so on. Its first version, or Al-Qaeda 1.0, was the generation of mujahideen fighters who rallied under the global jihadist banner to participate in the resistance to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This group consisted of fighters from Afghanistan, Southeast Asia, and across the Arab world. After the fall of Kabul in 1992 and the dispersion of the Mujahideen, some of the Arab fighters regrouped under Osama bin Laden and, after some organizational and ideological shifts, became Al-Qaeda 2.0, an organization devoted to waging global jihad through terrorist acts. It is this version of Al-Qaeda that conducted many of its most infamous attacks, the bombing of the USS Cole, the East Africa embassy bombings, and the 9/11 attacks. The enormous success of the September 11th attacks elevated the status of the group, giving rise to what some have called the Al-Qaeda movement. As disparate groups have rallied to the global jihad cause under the banner of Al-Qaeda, a new version, Al-Qaeda 3.0, has emerged. Though the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan initially crippled the original Al-Qaeda, this Al-Qaeda proper is reconstituting itself and continues to operate under its former command structure. Some pre-existing groups also joined the movement by allying themselves with bin Laden. In recent years, these groups have planned or carried out significant attacks in Indonesia, Northern Africa, and elsewhere in the world. Finally, several new self-generating groups have arisen in regional pockets around the world. These grassroots terrorist groups have conducted several high-profile attacks, including the London and Madrid bombings, and made a hefty contribution to the violence in Iraq. This movement, a loose confederation of like-minded terrorist groups, is the Al-Qaeda threat we now face. Though the original Al-Qaeda proper continues to attempt to reconstitute itself, it has lost centralized operating authority over the Al-Qaeda movement as a whole. First of all, many emerging groups cannot receive direct orders from Al-Qaeda proper because they have very few or no direct ties to it. For example, British investigations found that the 2005 London bombers conceived and conducted the attack completely independently from Al-Qaeda proper leadership. In other cases, there have been or continue to be links between Al-Qaeda proper and other groups in the movement. However, even in these cases, Al-Qaeda proper does not dictate attack targets and methods to the other factions. Thus, while the other factions may sometimes consult with Al-Qaeda proper leadership, in the end, each group carries out its attacks on its own. For example, Jamaat Islamiyah has and likely continues to enjoy a relationship of mutual benefit with Al-Qaeda proper, but it has always chosen its own attack targets. Finally, though jihadists have immortalized many of Al-Qaeda's operational techniques online, their interpretation and execution are not universally consistent or controlled. Sometimes the tactics these groups utilize are starkly different from those of Al-Qaeda proper. For instance, unlike Al-Qaeda proper, Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan have often killed Muslim civilians and been hostile to other jihadist groups. We also found great inconsistency in strategic plans in the movement. Basically, the movement follows no single roadmap. Instead, though groups may swear allegiance to Al-Qaeda proper, in practical terms, they each pursue their own agendas. For example, even since swearing its allegiance to Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb almost exclusively targeted installations of the Algerian government, which the group seeks to overthrow. Also, the 2004 Madrid train bombings were not part of any strategic vision promoted by the leadership of Al-Qaeda proper. Instead, the attacks were merely a result of that cell's assumption that influencing a local election to sway against U.S. policy in Iraq would benefit the global jihadist cause. The lack of a common strategic plan is also evidenced by the conflicts between factions in the movement. For instance, Al-Qaeda proper strongly disapproved of Al-Qaeda in Iraq's tactics. Clashes over affiliation with the movement have also arisen within individual groups, such as the tension in recent years that has divided members of Jama'a Islamiyah, caused splits in Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and inspired jihadist groups that fight in outright opposition to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Finally, though it is bound together by devotion to general ideals of global jihad, open sources indicate that there is no single intent driving the Al-Qaeda movement. First, no central authority in the movement manages the content and flow of global jihadist propaganda. Instead, each group has adopted and adapted the Al-Qaeda propaganda model for their own purposes. Even among individual factions, there is increasingly little unity in the dissemination of ideology. For example, within Al-Qaeda in Iraq, there are dozens of subgroups, each of which independently manages their media operations and tailor their message to meet their own needs. The loss of ideological control has also affected how new terrorists are recruited into the Al-Qaeda movement. To enter the movement now, up-and-coming terrorists increasingly self-radicalize via the internet or through social activities such as sports clubs. Accordingly, as each faction and its subgroups adapt the Al-Qaeda proper message to fit their needs, Al-Qaeda proper's core religious message has been diluted. Using religion as a medium to transmit its increasingly diffuse message, the movement is now tied to nebulous ideals revolving around social rebellion. Finally, we found that the centrality of the movement is likely to continue to deteriorate over at least the next 6 to 12 months. First of all, analysis of the operations conducted by the movement shows that the number of major attacks conducted under the direct leadership of Al-Qaeda proper continues to decrease each year. Also, considering the above-mentioned intergroup conflicts, the increasing diffusion of the global jihadist message, and the tarnishing of Al-Qaeda's reputation, the movement appears unlikely to develop or maintain a cohesive strategic plan or ideology in the near term. At this point, we'd like to take a little time to show you some of the tools and techniques used to develop this analysis. First of all, we should note that our team almost exclusively used free sources and software, showing that you don't necessarily have to spend lots of money to obtain and process high-quality information. We used a couple of novel collection techniques. One particularly interesting method we tried out was crowdsourcing, or outsourcing collection in the form of an open call. We did this first by submitting a request for assistance through a mass email to our intelligence studies student and alumni body. We also posted an open call for open source intelligence on one of our intelligence-related blogs. This blog has heavy readership from academia, think tanks, and intelligence practitioners. The result was that we developed many more collection resources than we would otherwise have been able to. Another method we used to fill some of the more difficult collection requirements was deep web searches. Finally, we set up our own project blog. This served as a single storage space that was accessible to the entire team, allowing each analyst to upload, catalog, and retrieve collection at any time. It also gave us a place to store information or visualizations for direct electronic access by the consumer if needed. To conclude, we'll make a couple of brief comments about the analytical and presentation tools that we used. First of all, we used several conceptual modeling programs to help us visualize and animate our data. Some of these programs are standard analyst tools, such as i2 Analyst Notebook, while others are Flash-based and online, like bubble.us. Lastly, we used the PARC software for analysis of competing hypotheses to help structure our findings. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions or comments regarding this analysis or our student programs, Please feel free to contact the Mercyhurst team using the below contact information.